All right, we're in Leviticus chapters 8 through 10. The first question, who was present at the consecration ceremony? In chapter 9, looking at verse 5, the latter part reads, and the entire assembly came near and stood before the Lord. So the entire camp of Israel is present at this occasion, on this occasion. The next question, what visible demonstrations of his presence and approval did God provide? The entire congregation is here. They've had already 7 days of consecrating Aaron and his sons. And now on this last day of the dedication, the great final day of the dedication, we see very explicitly the presence of God. This is in chapter 9 still, and looking at verse 23, it says, when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Everyone saw this, perhaps as the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire, the glory of the Lord, which is a phrase we often hear throughout the books of Moses. The glory of the Lord appears to all the people. And so there's a very plain revelation of the presence of God. All of the congregation is here. And then in addition to that, verse 24 of chapter 9 says, fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. That's the altar of burnt offering, the altar that's there in the courtyard of the tabernacle ground. This plain representation of by God sending fire to consume the offering was a very clear evidence of God's approval of this consecration ceremony. A part of this consecration was consecrating Aaron and his sons to be priests. They had already earlier anointed and sprinkled blood on different articles of the different furniture of the sanctuary. This is also a part of the consecration of the altar itself. And God shows his approval, his acceptance of them as his priests, his acceptance of the tabernacle as his dwelling place, his acceptance of the altar as the altar from which he would receive burnt offerings and other offerings from his people. He shows his approval by this magnificent display of his power, fire coming out from before the Lord. And it's in this context that we go to the next question. What did Nadab and Abihu do? These are the sons of Aaron who are also consecrated as a part of this as priests. In chapter 10, just a few verses after what we just read, verse 1 says, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, these are the things that they would hold the incense in and would burn incense in, and put fire in them and added incense. And they offered, this is the New International Version, uses the word unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. In the presence of the entire congregation, in the presence of the manifest glory of God, in the presence of the fire of God that has come and is burning on the altar, these two boys transgress the command of God and offer unauthorized fire before God. This lack of respect is an understatement. This open rebellion is a probably better depiction of what they did. This is what Nadab and Abihu did. The next question, what did God do in response? Verse 2, so fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Very dramatic response, very immediate response. We'd say maybe a very scary response, but this is how God responded. We're going to look a little bit at this response in the later questions here. The next question, what was Moses' explanation as to why God did what he did? It was a day of celebration. It was a good day. It was a day to rejoice in the fact that God had accepted them as his priests. God had accepted the tabernacle as his dwelling place, accepted the altar as the place for him to receive sacrifices. And on this day, now Moses has to grieve his nephews. Now Aaron has to grieve for his sons. And in fact, Moses tells Aaron, no, don't mourn for them. Don't tear your robe. Don't do the normal things of grieving, because you have to show that, no, this is acceptable because of what God did. Why, Moses? According to Moses in verse 3, Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke of when he said, among those who approach me, I will show myself holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored. That's probably the best word to describe it. It was a dishonor. It was an insult. It was a contempt for God, for in the presence of God, for them to openly rebel against his command. And God is saying, I will be honored before the people. He wouldn't allow this transgression to go unpunished. And so we see an immediate, a very scary, a very final act of punishment, if we want to call it that, of judgment, of God destroying them in response for this act. Next question, do you think this sin they committed was worse than the sin of Aaron with the golden calf? Why or why not? Now, it's difficult to kind of estimate the value of sin. Do we want to talk about it in terms of its effect? Was this more effective or had a greater negative consequences than the sin of Aaron? Or do we want to look at it obviously in terms of the punishment that came from God as a result of it? Aaron was forgiven, and here they were not forgiven and were stricken dead immediately. Well, there are different ways to look at it, but I don't want to argue about things that are trivial. But there are some differences that we can see, and there are also some similarities that we can see between the sin of Aaron with the golden calf and this sin. First, Aaron's sin, we would think, would be worse because Aaron not only sinned himself, but led the people into apostasy. He himself declared that tomorrow will be a feast to Jehovah when he made this golden calf. He said, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Aaron led the people of God in apostasy. That obviously would seem to make it a worse sin. They were doing something evil, but it was themselves. They were just disobeying themselves and not directly inviting or calling the people to follow them in their transgression. So on that level, we might feel that no, Aaron's sin was worse than this sin that they committed. Another thing, someone pointed out in our study that Aaron's sin was different in that he was really capitulating to the people. It was the people who came to him and said, make us gods to lead us, because this Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know where he is. And so he was being pressured, and he fell under the pressure. It wasn't him initiating the wrong. It wasn't him starting out and saying, I want to do something wrong. It was him just conceding, and at least he tried to say that this was a still representation of that God. And so we can kind of try to, rationalize his sin a little bit. And so it wasn't seemingly as bad as what they were doing, which was open rebellion. Again, I don't want to try and argue and say which one was worse of itself, but there are some reasons I believe that God chose to respond in the way he did. And in this case, while he forgave the sin of Aaron in the other case. Firstly, this was the occasion that it was, which is very different from the occasion we see with Aaron on Sinai. This is after the priesthood has been established. In the case of Aaron, though he was called to be the priest while he was doing that sin, he was not anointed as the priest as yet. This is after the priesthood, and particularly these boys themselves were the priests that God was setting aside and saying, these are the ones that can come to me on behalf of the people. And so they definitely now have a higher calling. And later we will see in Numbers chapter 16 that God shows a special preference for those who are his priests, and says that the people ought not rise up against them. When Korah, Dathan, and Abiram rise up against Aaron and the priesthood, they are stricken dead. And so we see God showing the line of demarcation between the priests that he has set aside and called to bring near to himself and the people. It says the people need to honor them. But if that's the line of demarcation, if the priests are near to God, and people should not throw stones at them, people should not speak negatively about them, if people should not, in the words of Paul quoting from the Old Testament, touch not the Lord's anointed, if they should not touch the Lord's anointed, then we see here that God takes it as his prerogative to touch his anointed, to punish and deal with his anointed. The story of David, someone mentioned that in our study, where David refused to raise a hand against Saul because he was the anointed of God. However, God dealt with Saul, and God brought this condemnation on Saul. So it seems to be that because God has put priests and even other spiritual leaders on a higher plane and said that even if they sin, that the people ought to respect their position, even if you can't respect them as an individual, ought to respect their position and be careful in how they treat them and be careful in how they talk about them, be careful in how they criticize them, because God has put them in the position and has allowed them to be in that position. If God has set up that, which the Bible, Old and New Testament, seems to indicate that he has, then God has taken it on himself to deal with such individuals. And we see that throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, that God holds leaders to a higher standard. James says it in these words, don't be many masters, because unto us is the greater condemnation, that God holds them to a higher standard. And so we see here, as we see with Hophni and Phinehas, as we see even in the case of Moses, that God holds leaders to a more stringent and a higher standard than others. And so perhaps that's one reason God responded. But I do think that one of the primary reasons that there was such an immediate and harsh response from God is the scene that we have here. That in the very presence of God, with the smoke from the fire that God has sent, ascending still into the clouds, with the glory of the Lord appearing before all people, if God allowed this, going to the last question, what do you think would have happened if God didn't do this? If God allows a disregard, a blatant, plain disregard of his commands in that context, we can only expect a greater evil than Israelites did anyway. If they don't see any response for a blatant disregard for the command of God, then they themselves would have no reason to regard God's commands highly. They would have no reason of themselves to honor God. Going to Moses' argument, God says, in the sight of all the people, I will be honored. And even if God did not want to kill the boys as he had to do, we see here that not doing so would have likely perpetuated. There's a verse in Ecclesiastes, I want to quickly turn there, a verse in Ecclesiastes where Solomon makes a very poignant observation about evil and about the perpetuity of evil because of the often lack of a speedy response to evil. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and looking at verse 11. Solomon says, when the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, the hearts of the people are filled with schemes to do wrong. If the sentence, again I'm repeating, if the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, the hearts of the people are filled with schemes to do wrong. And he's putting in observation, him as a king, having this experience, seeing what happens when sentences or crime are not quickly carried out. He's making this observation, which is true, and which I believe is part of the rationale for why God had to do what he did here. He had to quickly carry out the sentence for this crime so that the hearts of the people would not be filled with schemes to do wrong. And we know their hearts were still filled with schemes to do wrong, but at least this was some way to help restrain the evil that would have taken place. And so this is another reason. I cannot say that I fully understand the reasons and purposes of God. I cannot say that I can ever explain the reasons and the purposes of God, but I believe these reasons, as well as many other reasons that perhaps you could think of or others can think of throughout the Bible, I think these give us some insight into the reasons of God in this instance as to why the sentence was carried out so quickly and we would say so harshly.